So I thought what I would try and do is just show you a couple of examples from some of my candidates of the techniques and the tools that they've used in order to try and tease out how they would position themselves within their disciplinary realm. And of course, what all PhD students are trying to do in that sense is to define very clearly an area of knowledge in which they seek to make a contribution. And I've found working here and in Europe across design research and artistic research, as it's called in Europe, that this becomes one of the most confusing aspects in establishing what research is in the sorts of creative practice disciplines that we work in. And I want to tell one small story to illustrate that. And this is a story about an artist from Finland. She was a ceramicist who did a very beautiful practice-based PhD. At least the first half was very beautiful. She was a ceramic artist who made 3 exhibitions as the works of her PhD. They explored questions of femininity, of the female body, and she did quite radical things, like she used menstrual blood on the surface of porcelain clays and fired them as part of the process, and that gives an incredible technical result because there's lots of iron in blood and the iron reacts in a very particular way on the surface of the clay. And so these were really very beautiful works in a series of exhibitions. The work was a wonderful inquiry into that subject matter, if you like. But at a certain point in a PhD, after explaining the works themselves and what she had discovered in making those works, she said, now I must theorise the work. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see made in creative practice work. What she meant by theorise the work was that she would then begin to quote people like Kristeva and other feminist theorists, not feminists. Nothing wrong with those people. They operate in a very fine field of theory of their own, but it's a completely different disciplinary realm than the one that she had been doing all her work in. So what I want to talk about today is how do you correctly position yourself in relation to your disciplinary field without making what I would call a topological error and trying to locate yourselves with famous French philosophers, dead theorists, some alive theorists, whoever the latest most interesting theorist is. Instead of trying to situate yourself in someone else's realm, how do you situate yourself in the realm of the people who practice the discipline to which you're attempting to make a contribution? And the big mistake is to suddenly think that because you're doing a PhD, you're somehow going to make a contribution to philosophy. You are not. Don't try that. It's not going to get you very far. And have confidence that actually the other poets out there know what they're doing. And the poets who explore a particular way of making poetry hold a disciplinary realm that is valid and real. And if those peers in that disciplinary circle are doing things that you admire and that you wish to be part of, then that is your disciplinary realm. You might quote all sorts of other writers from other fields on your way through the PhD, but you're locating the contribution that you would make to knowledge in that realm. So that's a little bit of background. Now, how have some of my candidates do it? I've worked with architects, artists, ceramicists, landscape architects and urban designers mainly. So I'll show you a couple of examples from those fields. Maybe these techniques are translatable, but they're probably translatable in using very different techniques. So I'm going to show you a series that are drawing based, for example. Well, if you're in animation, actually maybe you want to be thinking about what would the animation version of that be. So to start off with, let's have a look at this. This is a drawing by one of my architect candidates, a New Zealand guy, Sam Kebbell. And what he's doing here is just showing us a group of works. These are the projects that make up my practice. So these could be the poems, the animations, the exhibitions of work, or the works, a series of works that have been made. And that's just to say, this is what I do. He then shows us a little bit about what some of this work would be. It's important to know, it's important to describe the work that makes up the PhD carefully so that we know what it is. And as he begins to go through this description, of course this is a very kind of sped up version, all of a sudden an image like this appears which starts to tell us something else. This is not what the work looks like or what the work is, it's what's going on in his world as he's thinking about projects, and this is very particular to the house example that we've been seeing. Ladies on deck chairs, Van Buren's one of his installations, and then this is the interior of that house, and working here is Peter Adset, who was the client and who introduced into the conversation in the procurement of this work, because architecture is a complicated art, if you want to call it that, because the client's voice and the client conversation comes into projects as much as anything else. And in this case, they share a conversation about Sam's fascination with objects, ordinary objects like deck chairs, and the ladies sitting in deck chairs, to which Peter Adset replies, there's a fantastic series of works by Van Buren on that. They talk about it, and you can begin to see little hints of what happens out of that conversation there, where in fact that conversation about the deck chair, about a particular artwork, resolves a very difficult technical detail in the work, which is this balustrade detail. And in fact the balustrade becomes a striped deck chair, and if you go back to the first image in the wrong one. You can see that in fact it becomes one of the major elements of the finished work. So in that story, a number of things start to happen. We not only learn about the work itself, but we start to see other elements that come in and affect the work. And this is part of situating the work within a bigger context. And what we can point to there, a couple of things. One, for Sam Kebbell, the client group actually becomes an important part of what you would call a community of practice, which influences and impacts the way the work is made. And other motives appear, like Van Buren's work, the deck chair. And Sam made this very simple drawing just to tell that one story about that one piece of work, just about the deck chair and Van Buren's work. And this was after many attempts to try and begin to situate around each work what is really going on as that work is produced. What are the things floating in and out of the space in which this work is made that begins to allow us to see a little bit more into what's going on in the practice itself. I've done a couple of different lectures which are on Vimeo that you might also look at. One of them deals with the idea of urges and fascinations which run through creative practices, and I think these are critical elements in determining what research is going on. And in this example, that fascination with the relationship between the objects of the everyday and objects that come out of places like the art world and how they intersect. This is one of Sam's fascinations, which he continually returns to in every work, but in every work in slightly different ways. So what Sam discovered was all of a sudden here's a technique for telling a very precise story about one element of a project. And we decided that to date in his PhD project, and this is probably about 8 months into the PhD, that it would be worth repeating that. So he began to then say, okay, well, not just the deck chair, but what else is going on? And what begins to congeal around the outside of this drawing then is that community of practice which makes up the disciplinary realm to which he wishes to make a contribution. And he begins to add, importantly, into there other architects who are dealing with similar conditions and similar ways of working. And then Sam can begin to point to, well, precisely how does he go about integrating those kinds of the narratives and stories of his clients, how those narratives overlap with his own practice trajectory, the fascinations and the urges. And what he begins to show for us is a very particular example of how his creative practice works, and that's one contribution to knowledge that he will be able to claim at the end of the day. So he begins to build up more and more evidence about what works around that project, and then he uses the technique to explore a whole series of projects, and he's created now a series of similar drawings for the core projects that he's picked out of his practice as being the projects that will be able to help him demonstrate and show his PhD in its final form. Last week I did a Skype session with him, and he showed me an even more beautiful drawing, which I wish I had, but I won't have for another couple of weeks yet, which is now a kind of, he's done it as a column because of course he's an architect, but there's a big column at the centre of the drawing, and hinging off that column is then each of these projects. So he now has a drawing where he can look at his practice across the series of projects, and he can see into and show us into all the sorts of things that are situated around each project in his working space. And that's a very different picture to the picture that we saw right at the beginning, which is the picture which says, "This is my practice." You know, it's a series of pictures of projects. Now he has, if you can imagine, this drawing and the drawings of those other projects stacked up around a column. And what he can start to say is, well, that's interesting, because if I then look at how this fascination with artworks works, let's investigate that, or objects of the everyday. Let's look at how that reappears in each of the projects as we go through. Let's see, in terms of the other important architects who he knows to be working in this area, where do they sit around these projects? How would I describe them in relation to this drawing? So that's one example. Let me move to another example. This is an example of a ceramicist. She makes very beautiful work, and she was really struggling with this idea of how to situate her work at that big level. You know, in my PhD, how do I describe the disciplinary realm to which I wish to make a contribution? So in the end, we said to her, look, can you just get each of your ceramic pieces out on the table and arrange around them who are the other technicians, artists, fabricators, all the sorts of people that she works with. Who are those people, and how can you arrange them around each of your works according to their importance to that work? And so what she made was these worlds of different people who have influenced different works in different ways. And what you can see, for example, is that there's a few of them that reappear from time to time, where you can see where those reappearances are. It's not the same with every work. It varied from work to work. This was then a very interesting story for her to tell about the ways in which each work moves slightly differently in the realm in which she's operating. So that was another interesting technique which unlocked for her a way of telling a story about what I would describe as the community of practice, the disciplinary field within which you work and also to which you seek to make a contribution. In traditional academic terms, you would do this with a literature review. So you would get all the literature on humanoidics, which is relevant to your particular area of inquiry. That would establish the disciplinary realm to which you seek to make a contribution. You would read all those works and you would point to them in your dissertation and say, what is the unique contribution that you make? In creative practices, we have to think more broadly than just people who wrote books and people who wrote texts, and we have to think about who are the other practitioners, the other artists, the other creatives who have sought to make a contribution to this particular field in which we work. And they need to be included as well as writers. Nothing wrong with writing a book. This is not a diatribe against text. It's just saying, in addition to text, there are other things that you could have books floating around in this space. And a number of our candidates, like this one, Steve Larkin, are Irish and they have a propensity to text. So there's a lot of texts that keep emerging. But in Steve's case, he's a Irish farm boy who grew up in a tradition of music, and when he talks about music, he doesn't mean performance, he means communication. So for him, music is not playing music to other people, it's playing music with people, and it becomes like a conversation. So for him, playing the fiddle is sitting in a small space like a kitchen, playing a fiddle while other people join in and play with him. And he talks about the ways in which that musical tradition, and it's all oral music too, he didn't learn to read music till much later, how that impacts very heavily on the way that he thinks about and sees landscape and architecture, which is the realm in which he works. So when he was trying to work out what his disciplinary field was, he located his own practice here and then started to say, okay, well, there's musicians, there's architects I work very closely with in Ireland, and he just began to try and position these people in terms of their closeness to him and his personal everyday experience, and also their influence. And he had a transcendent group up the top there who are the famous dead people, but are nonetheless towering figures in the realm in which he's working. So this was his first attempt to try and describe that. He then did this remarkable drawing, and he began to talk about this kind of world of influence that sits around each project that he works on as being a combination of objects and compositional sets. And just to give you some sense of what he means by that, an object might be a building or a brick, but it might also be a note. And a compositional set is the kind of lyrical combinations that are received culturally. And this would be in terms of the Irish tunes that he grew up listening to. So when he's playing the fiddle, he's drawing on a whole series of compositional sets as part of that music making. So he began to try and make this. I have no idea what this drawing means, so please don't think that I'm showing you this as a evidence of some crystal clear thinking as yet. I'll show you this version because it's, and we'll just zoom in on a little bit of detail. But what he did was make, and this drawing was from about here to the window long, so it's a massive drawing. And he's just trying to set out those relationships and begin to explore them. So it's an exploratory drawing rather than an explanation drawing. Again, I had a supervisory meeting with him in the last week, and that has now turned into a very, very clear representation of how those musicians and those architects and designers fit in a disciplinary realm in which he's seeking to make a contribution. So he's becoming now very, very clear about where his work is situated through that way of making drawings. I wanted to show you that one partly because it doesn't yet make sense. There's a lot of information there, and I think you need to work through those kinds of processes to get to a way that would be very particular to your practice in terms of describing your disciplinary realm. And that, if there's one piece of advice I could give, it is that you will need to discover your own way of representing it and showing us what that is. Otherwise, I doubt that you'll really get to a very fine understanding of that. Another technique, this is PRS 2, so this is early on in the process, but this guy, and this is situating your work slightly differently. This was how he dealt with a series of his urban projects. And what he did was he collected together a whole lot of postcards, and on one face of the postcard is the picture of the city or the urban condition in which he was working, and on the back of the postcard would be a description of some important aspect or other. But he was using that play between the front and the back of the postcard as a way of situating the work in the context in which he was working. So this is now context in the actual physical city context that he was working. So there are a couple of hopefully useful insights. I'll point to a couple of other resources you can look at. I've probably used my full 20 minutes, so I'll end there. But here's a Vimeo that might be useful. It's how to do a practice-based PhD in 3 minutes, so you could knock yours off later this afternoon. I won't show you the full 3 minutes. That would spoil the surprise. There's a slightly longer version of that called Framework for a Practice-Based PhD, and in that one I make a drawing to try and show how through examining a series of projects you can and if you imagine each one of those little dots is
process begins then with the practitioner.
Oh, that's me.
Being invited to.
Shut up. If you imagine each one of those dots is a project, so each one is a poem or an artwork or a animation or something, and the movie goes on to sort of try and show how at a certain point you begin to look back into those projects as a collection, and then you're beginning to look at your practice, and then you can begin to say how that practice is situated alongside other practices. And that's really a very effective way of situating your work. And the last one is this one, which was a guest lecture at our guest at my own PRS. But in this one, I use this idea of 3 orders of knowledge as a way of describing the contributions that creative practice PhDs, in my view, how they make those contributions. It's very persistent. And to summarise those, the first order of knowledge that we learn about through looking at any particular practice is the individual, what goes on in the individual project. So you can imagine Sam's first drawing of the house revealing to us what happened in the making of that house, so we can see inside the creative process in some way that we couldn't see before. The second order of knowledge is at a slightly broader sense, where Sam begins to look at all of those projects collectively. So now we're looking at his column drawing, which we haven't seen, but hopefully you've imagined in some way. And we're looking across the projects, and we're starting to then be able to see how collectively those projects seek to make a contribution to his disciplinary realm. And the third order of knowledge is where we say, okay, we've got Sam Kebble's architectural practice here, we've got Steve Larkin's architectural practice here, and we can start to see across a range of practices. This would be the third order of knowledge. They're not hierarchical. The first order of knowledge around a project can have remarkable impact in a disciplinary field, just as the third order can, looking across a range of practitioners. And I think it helps, my candidates tell me it helps to think about the field that you're in those terms. So in your own work, how do you look at a single project? How do you look collectively at the series of projects that you've made as part of your creative practice PhD? And how would you look at your practice compared with the practices of your peers, some of whom might be in this room, others of whom might be in other countries or far away? And you can then talk about different ways in which you are able through your PhD to demonstrate a contribution. So you can look those up on Vimeo if you want to see more detail. I think through Pia we can provide links to those. Thank you very much.